Hello everyone, and welcome to my BNB CBS Gossip 24 channel. Remy burst into tears the moment the words finally clawed their way out of his chest, and in that instant the air between him and Bill seemed to shatter like glass, because this wasn't just another secret, another scheme, another carefully calculated half-truth in the long, messy history of their lives. This was a paternity bombshell so devastating it felt like it rearranged the past, the present, and the future all at once. And as Remy's shoulders shook and his carefully constructed composure collapsed, he confessed in a broken, hoarse whisper that he was the biological father of Luna's unborn child, that the baby everyone thought was someone else's, the baby already wrapped in assumptions, expectations, and whispered judgments, was his, and Bill, powerful, unflinching Bill Spencer, the man who had stared down enemies, lawsuits, and personal betrayals without blinking, felt the shock slam into him so hard he actually staggered back a step, his face draining of color as if the ground beneath him had suddenly given way, because Luna's pregnancy had already been complicated, already loaded with emotional landmines, but this revelation detonated everything, turning concern into disbelief, disbelief into fury, and fury into a profound, aching sense of betrayal that cut deeper than Bill wanted to admit. Remy kept talking through the tears, words spilling out in a desperate rush as if he was terrified that if he stopped, even for a second, he'd lose the courage to finish. Explaining how it had happened, how it was never supposed to mean anything, how loneliness and bad timing and unresolved feelings had collided one night when both he and Luna were vulnerable and reckless, how they'd convinced themselves it was a mistake they could bury, but mistakes have consequences, and Luna's pregnancy was living proof that the truth always finds its way to the surface, no matter how deeply it's buried, and Bill could barely process the details because all he could see was the ripple effect, the damage the secret had already caused and the devastation it was still going to unleash once it came out, because it wouldn't just affect Remy and Luna, it would tear through families, loyalties, and carefully balanced alliances like a storm. And as Remy confessed that Luna had begged him to stay silent, terrified of losing everything, terrified of being judged, terrified of how Bill would react, Bill's jaw clenched so tightly it ached, because part of him understood fear all too well, but another part of him burned with anger at being kept in the dark, at being manipulated by omission, at having his trust exploited in such a monumental way. The room felt smaller with every word, the walls closing in as Bill replayed every recent interaction with Luna in his mind, every glance, every hesitation, every moment that now took on a different meaning. And the realization that he'd been standing so close to the truth without seeing it made his stomach churn, while Remy sobbed openly now, no longer trying to hold it together, admitting that the guilt had been eating him alive, that every ultrasound, every mention of the baby, every conversation about the future felt like another knife twisting deeper into his conscience, and that he couldn't live with the lie anymore, not when an innocent child was involved, not when Bill deserved to know the truth, even if it meant losing everything in the process. Bill's response, when it finally came, was low and dangerous. A quiet fury that was somehow more terrifying than shouting, as he demanded to know how long this had been going on, how long Remy had been looking him in the eye knowing this secret, and Remy's answer, that he'd known almost from the beginning, hit like a second punch to the gut, because it meant this betrayal was calculated, sustained, and deliberate, and Bill felt something crack inside him, a trust he didn't even realize he still had for Remy splintering beyond repair. The irony of it all wasn't lost on him either, because Bill Spencer was no stranger to scandal, secrets, or messy paternity drama, yet standing on this side of the revelation, feeling blindsided and humiliated, was a different kind of pain altogether, one that made him question not just Remy's integrity but Luna's as well, and as he paced the room, running a hand through his hair, his mind raced ahead to the fallout, to the inevitable moment when this truth would explode into the open and everyone would have an opinion, a judgment, a demand, because in their world secrets never stayed secret for long. Remy, through his tears, begged Bill not to destroy Luna, insisting she was already fragile, already overwhelmed, already terrified of becoming a single mother in the public eye, and that she'd only kept the truth hidden because she thought she was protecting everyone, including Bill, from pain. But Bill shot back that lies don't protect anyone, they just postpone the damage, making it worse when it finally comes, and the bitterness in his voice made Remy flinch, because this wasn't just anger, it was disappointment, the kind that lingers long after the shouting stops, As the weight of the unborn child hung between them, Bill demanded to know what Remy planned to do now, whether he intended to step up as a father or continue hiding behind half measures and apologies, and Remy, wiping his face with trembling hands, swore that he would take responsibility, that he wanted to be part of the baby's life, that he loved Luna despite everything and couldn't abandon their child the way his own father had abandoned him, a confession that added another raw layer to the moment and made Bill pause despite himself, because trauma has a way of repeating itself when it's left unexamined. Still, sympathy didn't erase betrayal, and Bill made it painfully clear that things would never be the same, that this truth would change how he saw both Remy and Luna forever, and that while he hadn't decided what he would do next, he refused to be complicit in a lie that big, especially when an innocent life was about to enter the world. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating, broken only by Remy's uneven breathing as he waited for Bill's verdict, knowing there might not be forgiveness waiting on the other side of his honesty, but also knowing that for the first time since Luna told him she was pregnant, he wasn't carrying the secret alone. And as Bill finally turned back to him, eyes hard but clear, he warned Remy that the truth had a way of demanding its price, and from this moment on, none of them would be able to escape the consequences, because Luna's baby wasn't just a private matter anymore, it was a catalyst, a ticking time bomb that would expose hidden loyalties, test fragile relationships, and force every person involved to choose between self-preservation and doing what was right. And as Remy nodded through his tears, fully aware that his breakdown had changed everything, one truth rang louder than the rest in that charged, devastating moment: secrets may feel safer in the dark, but once they're dragged into the light, they have the power to burn everything in their path, and nothing, absolutely nothing, would ever be the same again. The silence Bill left behind after that warning didn't feel empty, it felt loaded, as if the room itself were holding its breath, waiting to see who would break first, and Remy, still wrecked and hollowed out from his confession, understood with a sick certainty that this wasn't an ending at all but the beginning of something far more dangerous, because Bill Spencer didn't explode impulsively, he calculated, he observed, and when he moved, he did so with devastating precision, and that knowledge gnawed at Remy as Bill finally walked out without another word, the door closing with a quiet finality that echoed louder than any shout ever could, leaving Remy alone with his thoughts, his guilt, and the terrifying realization that Luna's secret, once contained between two terrified hearts, had now escaped into a world that thrived on scandal, judgment, and collateral damage. Hours later, when Remy finally found Luna, she knew immediately that something had gone wrong, because the look on his face, ashen, exhausted, stripped of pretense, told her the truth before he ever spoke, and the moment he confirmed that Bill knew everything, her knees nearly buckled, panic flooding her system as she pressed a hand protectively over her stomach, the life inside her suddenly feeling heavier, more fragile, more exposed than ever, and she whispered Bill's name like a prayer and a curse all at once, fear tightening her chest as she demanded to know what he'd said, what he'd threatened, what he planned to do, but Remy could only shake his head, admitting that Bill hadn't revealed his next move, which somehow made it worse, because uncertainty was far more terrifying than outright rage, and Luna felt tears sting her eyes as the carefully built illusion of control she'd been clinging to crumbled completely. For Luna, the pregnancy had already been overwhelming before the truth came out: scrutiny, expectations, whispers about the father, the future, her choices, but now it felt like she was standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing the fall was inevitable and public, and she lashed out at Remy through her fear, accusing him of betraying her, of breaking his promise to protect her and their baby, even as part of her knew, deep down, that the secret had been rotting them from the inside and would have destroyed them anyway if it had stayed buried, and Remy accepted her anger without defending himself, because he deserved it, because guilt was the only thing that felt honest anymore, and he told her quietly that he couldn't let their child be born into a lie, not when the consequences would only grow worse with time. Meanwhile, Bill didn't go home, he went to his office, because when his world tilted off its axis, work was the one place where he could regain a sense of control, and as he poured himself a drink he barely touched, his mind replayed Remy's confession over and over, each repetition sharpening his anger but also forcing him to confront uncomfortable truths about himself, about how many times he demanded honesty from others while tolerating deception when it suited him, and about how Luna's fear mirrored the fear he'd seen in so many people caught in his orbit, people who loved him, needed him, and were terrified of what would happen if he turned against them. Still, understanding didn't equal forgiveness, and Bill's thoughts kept circling back to the baby, an innocent life already caught in the crossfire of adult mistakes, and the more he considered it, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about betrayal, it was about responsibility, about who would step up when the fallout hit, and whether he would choose to burn everything down out of pride or try, for once, to act with restraint, and that internal battle raged through him as dawn crept closer, the city outside his window slowly waking up to a day that would change lives forever. When the news inevitably leaked, as it always did in their world, it hit like an earthquake, sending shockwaves through family, friends, and rivals alike, and suddenly Luna's pregnancy was no longer a private struggle but headline material, dissected and debated by people who didn't care about the emotional wreckage left behind, only the drama of it all, and Luna found herself drowning in judgment. Every decision she'd ever made re-examined through the lens of this revelation, while Remy was painted alternately as a tragic figure and a villain, depending on who was telling the story, and Bill, despite his efforts to stay out of it, was dragged into the narrative simply by association, his name once again tied to scandal he hadn't created but couldn't escape. The pressure pushed Luna to a breaking point, and one night, alone and terrified, she confronted Bill herself, her voice trembling but determined as she told him she understood his anger, his sense of betrayal, but begged him not to let it consume him, not to punish an unborn child for the sins of its parents, and Bill, faced with her raw vulnerability, felt his defenses falter, because this wasn't a power play or a manipulation, it was a woman fighting to protect her child, and in that moment, the lines between enemy and ally blurred in a way that left him shaken, forcing him to confront the fact that while he couldn't change what had happened, he could choose what happened next. Remy, watching from the sidelines, felt both hope and dread as Bill's stance began to shift, because acceptance, if it came, wouldn't erase the damage, and stepping into the role of a father meant facing his own fears, his own history of abandonment and failure, head-on, and as he prepared himself for that reality, he realized that confession wasn't the end of his reckoning, it was the first step toward accountability, toward becoming someone worthy of the child he'd helped create, even if that journey meant enduring judgment, rejection, and the loss of relationships he might never get back. In the weeks that followed, fragile truces formed and broke, emotions flared and cooled, and the truth continued to ripple outward, reshaping relationships in subtle and not-so-subtle ways, and while forgiveness remained uncertain and trust painfully slow to rebuild, one thing became impossible to ignore: Luna's baby, once a secret shrouded in fear, had become a catalyst for change, forcing everyone involved to confront who they were, what they valued, and how far they were willing to go to protect the innocent amid the wreckage of their own mistakes. And as Luna felt her baby move for the first time during a moment of quiet reflection, she clung to the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, something good could still come from all this chaos, even if the path forward was anything but clear. The fragile calm that followed those first explosive weeks never truly settled, it only hovered uneasily, like smoke after a fire, because every conversation, every glance, every silence was now weighted with what had been revealed and what still hadn't been resolved, and Luna felt it most acutely in the quiet moments when she was alone, when the noise of speculation faded and she was left with her thoughts and the steady reminder of the life growing inside her, a life that seemed to pulse with both hope and fear, and she wondered constantly what kind of world her child would be born into, whether it would be defined by resentment and blame or by a hard-earned kind of grace forged through painful honesty. Bill, despite himself, found his life bending around that same question, because no matter how hard he tried to compartmentalize, the truth had embedded itself into his daily routine, surfacing at unexpected moments, during meetings where his attention drifted, during late nights when the city lights blurred and memories crept in, reminding him of his own complicated history with fatherhood, of choices he'd made that still haunted him, and of the uncomfortable realization that Remy's confession had cracked something open inside him that he'd kept sealed for years, forcing him to confront not just their betrayal, but his own pattern of control, his instinct to dominate situations rather than nurture them. Remy, meanwhile, began the slow, humbling process of proving that his words weren't empty, that his breakdown hadn't been a one-time eruption of guilt but the start of genuine change, and it wasn't dramatic or grand the way soap opera gestures often were, it was quiet and consistent, showing up to appointments, asking questions he was afraid of the answers to, listening when Luna needed to vent her fear and anger without trying to fix it or defend himself, and each small act felt like penance. Like laying another brick in a foundation he hoped might one day support something stable, even though he knew there were no guarantees. The first major test came when Bill finally agreed to sit down with both of them together, a meeting heavy with tension before a single word was spoken, because this wasn't about confrontation anymore, it was about boundaries, expectations, and the future, and as they sat across from each other, Luna gripping Remy's hand while Bill watched them with an expression that was guarded but no longer openly hostile, the reality of their shared connection became undeniable, and Bill surprised them both by stating plainly that while he would never condone the deception, he refused to let bitterness dictate his involvement moving forward, a declaration that felt less like forgiveness and more like a ceasefire, but one that still carried immense weight. That conversation didn't magically heal old wounds, but it shifted the dynamic in a way none of them had anticipated, because Bill began asking questions, not accusations, not demands, but genuine questions about the baby, about plans, about what kind of support would actually help rather than harm, and Luna, caught off guard by the change in tone, found herself opening up despite her fear, admitting how isolated she'd felt, how terrified she was of being defined solely by the scandal, and Bill listened in a way that was rare for him, absorbing her words without interrupting, perhaps recognizing echoes of his own past mistakes in her vulnerability. Outside that room, the world remained unforgiving, and the public narrative continued to twist and evolve, but something subtle shifted in how Luna carried herself, because for the first time since the truth came out, she felt less alone, less like she was bracing herself against an inevitable collapse, and while judgment still stung and rumors still circulated, they no longer felt quite as powerful, because she was slowly reclaiming ownership of her story rather than letting it be defined by whispers and headlines. As Luna's pregnancy progressed, milestones arrived with a bittersweet edge, moments that should have been purely joyful but were complicated by unresolved emotions, and the first time Remy felt the baby kick, he broke down all over again, overwhelmed by the reality of it, by the undeniable proof that this wasn't just a scandal or a mistake but a living being who would one day look to him for guidance, love, and stability, and in that moment, his fear eclipsed everything else, because he knew that love alone wouldn't be enough to undo years of his own unresolved trauma, that becoming the father his child deserved would require confronting parts of himself he'd spent a lifetime avoiding. Bill watched these developments from a careful distance, never fully stepping out of the picture but no longer looming over it either, and his internal struggle continued quietly, because every act of maturity from Remy chipped away at his anger while simultaneously reminding him of his own shortcomings, and one late evening, after a particularly long day, Bill found himself staring at a photo from years ago, a reminder of a moment when he'd chosen pride over presence, control over connection. And he wondered, not for the first time, whether this situation was forcing him into a second chance of sorts, an opportunity to choose differently, not just for Luna's child, but for himself. The tension reached another breaking point when complications arose late in Luna's pregnancy, a scare that sent everyone rushing to the hospital, fear cutting through lingering resentment with brutal efficiency, and as they waited for updates, Remy pacing, Luna pale but resolute, Bill standing slightly apart yet clearly affected, the reality of what truly mattered crystallized in a way no argument ever could, because in the face of potential loss, old grudges felt small and hollow, and when the doctor finally assured them that both Luna and the baby would be okay, the collective exhale felt like a turning point, a moment that recalibrated priorities and stripped away what no longer served them. After that night, something shifted permanently, not into a fairy tale resolution, but into a cautious, hard-earned understanding, and Bill began showing up in quiet ways, checking in without pressure, offering support without strings, while Remy continued proving his commitment through action rather than promises, and Luna, stronger than she realized, began envisioning a future that wasn't defined solely by survival but by intention, by the conscious decision to break cycles rather than repeat them. When the baby was finally born, the moment arrived not with explosive drama but with profound stillness, the kind that settles in your bones and reminds you that some things are bigger than scandal, bigger than pride, bigger than pain, and as Luna held her child for the first time, tears streaming down her face, she felt a sense of clarity she hadn't known in months, because despite everything that had gone wrong, something indescribably right had emerged from the chaos, and that truth anchored her in a way nothing else could. Remy, standing beside her, felt the weight of responsibility settle onto him fully for the first time, not as fear but as resolve, and Bill, watching from just outside the room, felt his own defenses soften as he took in the scene, realizing that while the past couldn't be rewritten, the future was still being written in real time, shaped by choices made in moments like this, when ego stepped aside and something more human took its place. Nothing was magically fixed after that day, relationships remained complex, trust remained fragile, and forgiveness continued to be a process rather than an event, but as Luna's baby slept peacefully, unaware of the storm that had preceded their arrival, one truth stood out above all others: the paternity bombshell that had once threatened to destroy them had instead forced them into brutal honesty, painful growth, and unexpected connection, and while scars remained, they were no longer open wounds, but reminders of how close everything had come to falling apart, and how, against all odds, they'd chosen to face the truth and move forward anyway.